will not be personally offended. I think that's a great idea that Harold was mentioning just now, to use times like this to serve one another. That's what the body is about, right? But if you do choose to stay here, let's jump into it. We're going to continue with our series, Politics in Poetry, the work of the 8th century prophets, also known as the classical prophets. After tonight, I'm trying to calculate how many more weeks. I think we have 3 weeks together after this, if I've calculated correctly. And we are in the last of these 8th century prophets that we'll be studying together, the prophet Isaiah. Tonight's theme I'm entitling, My Love Had a Vineyard. This is taken from the text we'll deal with primarily tonight, Isaiah chapter 5. We want to consider the idea that prophets of old, well before Jesus came on the scene, already were using parables. And Jesus, among other things, he continues that tradition, which was already well known in the Jewish context, of using parables both to teach his audience and also to challenge them out of their comfort zones. And that's what Isaiah does in what we talk about tonight. Hell draws a lot of people's attention, doesn't it? How many of you're familiar with this scenario? You're driving down the road. There is a terrible wreck off to the side, and how many of us cannot help but do some rubbernecking, right? We have this fascination, for better or worse, some kind of curiosity, what went down over there? And hopefully, at the very least, we offer a prayer for those people, but we have to admit, these kind of things distract us. Sometimes the tragic, the grotesque, our attention is drawn to that. And sure enough, the concept of hell is one that's present in the Bible. But in many circumstances, the classic notion of hell, how it's been preached within the Bible, taught about, gets conflated throughout church history with other concepts that were not always meant to be talking about hell. And I mention this because we're going to be talking about one such topic tonight. I want to challenge you to move away from some of our grotesque fascination with hell. How many of us in the past have spent at least sometimes meditating on what is hell? What would that even be like? Did God create that? How does that come to be in the first place? And yet, what I want to encourage you tonight is to think about how, just as on the road, if there is a terrible accident over here, it's not in your best interest to get sidetracked. Otherwise, you may be giving some other drivers on the road something to look at in the future. So you need to keep your eyes straight ahead, right? You have your goal in mind, and as many of your parents might have taught you in the past, don't look over there when you're driving. You look straight ahead. Well, I think it's the same thing in terms of God's discourses in the Bible in general about hell and about punishment. We can fixate on that, and yet God, in many respects, would like to have a conversation with his people, and for his people to come to be on the same level, discussing matters of justice with him, things that matter to him. And sometimes we can't fully do that if we get distracted by the matters of hell, at least what we've made it to be in much of Christian tradition. You'll see, I think, over time what I mean tonight as we go into our study. But we begin the first verses of Isaiah chapter 5. Let me sing a song for my beloved, a song of my love concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a fruitful hill. He dug around it, removed its stones, and planted a vine in it. He built a tower in the middle of it, and he even dug out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce grapes, but it produced rotten ones. Thus ends what we can call a parable, even though the text does not explicitly call it that. Now, you and I know Isaiah here as a prophet, he's not merely interested in grapes, rotten or good. He's not merely interested in some kind of farmer out there who grows this vineyard. This must stand for weightier matters. This is what you can see as a fully fledged metaphor, right, strung out over a storied concept. You could also even just go ahead and call it allegory. Don't you get that sense? Every little thing mentioned in this must be some kind of symbol for something else that we're talking about. We get the gist of that simply by knowing the character of what Isaiah has written about already in this book. So what is this parable about? Just like Jesus' disciples, when they come to him, sometimes having to ask him, what did you mean by that parable? Some of them make sense, right? Some of them, if you notice carefully in the Gospels, Jesus does not explain every one, but you get it. You get the gist. Other parables, like, for example, the parable of the sower who went out to sow and some seed fell here and there, well, that one needs some explanation. It's not made clear by the parable alone. And so here, too, we need an explanation. It's always helpful when the prophet does give us one, and sure enough, he does. So here's the explanation given by the prophet Isaiah. Now, O inhabitant of Jerusalem, O people of Judah, please judge between me and my vineyard. Keep in mind here, ultimately, this is Isaiah speaking with the voice of the Lord, with the voice of Yahweh. So this is Yahweh's vineyard we're coming to see. What is there left to do for my vineyard that I have not already done for it? Recall with me here for a moment. What has this vineyard owner of the parable done for that vineyard to make it successful? Okay, clear the ground, right? Remove those stones. Yeah, right. So planted a choice vine in there. Yep, a tower. A tower in this sense, this is to watch out for things like foxes and the like that might want to sneak in there and nibble on your plants. So people in the ancient world, there would be these little watchtowers. They might even invite the kids to sling stones at those creatures and so forth. What else is... Say again? Yeah, dug a wine vat. That's where you crush grapes in the season, right? You crush them and then they are filtered into the wine vat itself. That speaks to a positive expectation, right? You would only make that if you are presuming that you will have a good harvest, a good vintage, I should say. All right? And he builds a protective fence as well, right? So what more could he do? What's the answer? Nothing, right? He goes to every length to make sure that this is a successful vineyard. And notice this question that follows. Why then, when I expected it to produce grapes, meaning good grapes, did it produce rotten ones? So, if I had one of my parable students here, I've taught parables now for 2 semesters at Oklahoma Christian. That might seem strange to you since I'm an Old Testament guy, Hebrew Bible guy. But I say I feel very much at home in the parables because that began as a Jewish method even before Jesus started using that method of teaching. So it was very much at home in that context where he spoke. And if I had one of my parable students today, I could very well feel confident asking the student, what kind of parable is this? And one of these students would tell you all today, this is a juridical parable. That is to say, it falls in this category of parables where you as the audience, you hear this story that is a metaphor, it's an allegory, and there may be no connections you can immediately make with your own scenario. Why, Isaiah, are you talking about grapes? What does that have to do with us? But nonetheless, you hear the story for what it is on the surface, and you render a judgment. That's why it's called juridical parable, right? So do you see that element here? It's in the questioning of the Lord, right? What more could I have done that I didn't already? Have I somehow fallen short in my task of ownership or the vineyard? And nobody would fault this owner of the vineyard for having missed a step. Everything is meticulously taken care of, and yet somehow, beyond reason, the vine does not succeed. It produces rotten grapes. And so the people together, they might even have been expected to respond in this scenario, or maybe it's just posed rhetorically. One way or another, though, the audience is on board with what Isaiah wants to pull them into. That is to say, yes, it's the grapes' fault. It's the vine's fault. Nothing to do with you. You did everything you could. But here's the other side of a juridical parable. It's brought home when the deliverer of that parable turns on the audience and says, guess what? You're the vine. Jesus used juridical parables as well. They were one of his many types of parables. And those are the parables. You can look out for these in your own reading time of the Gospels. Look for those parables where he pulls a gotcha on his audience and says, but that's you. Look for those. So here is Isaiah's version of the same thing. Now let me tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. Remove its hedge and let it go to burning. Break apart its wall and let it become a tromping ground, presumably for animals. I shall make an end of it. It shall not be pruned or hoed. And thorns and thistles shall come up. To the clouds I shall give command not to shower rain upon it. Indeed, the vineyard of Yahweh of armies is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. That's the punch of a juridical parable. It lands on the audience, and the audience renders a judgment only to have it come back on their heads, unbeknownst to them when they first rendered that judgment. Can you think of any other examples of a similar type of parable? Yes. Yeah. Amos is a great example, and we started with Amos, didn't we? Talking about God's judgment upon these nations, rightly deserved, but then it comes home. One of the most famous examples is Nathan's parable, you can call that a parable, to David, about the one rich man that stole the poor man's only sheep. Remember that one? And then remember that line that just echoes over eternity, you are that man. Scary when you've already rendered judgment and you realize, oh, I am in the wrong. And David did. The question would be, would Isaiah's audience understand the same thing? And he goes on to say, in respect to Judah, the people of Judah as God's vineyard, he, God, expected justice, but there was bloodshed. He expected righteousness, but there was outcry. And among other things, not only is this a terrible disappointment, this is the positive grapes that he expected versus the sour grapes. Now we understand that metaphor, right? But it's also a play on words. You see there the Hebrew words I've put on the screen. He expected justice, mishpat. That matters a lot to God. I think everybody, if you've been to this series, if not already well before, understand that about God. Both God in the Old Testament and the New, justice matters to him. And justice includes matters that we also today call charity. That's also a part of God's justice. That's what God is looking for. But instead he gets not mishpat, justice, but mispach. Sounds somewhat like it, but those are sour grapes. All right? Bloodshed is certainly the farthest from justice you can get. Righteousness is what the owner of this vineyard expected, as the metaphor, tzedakah in Hebrew. But instead, he doesn't get tzedakah, righteousness, which is akin to justice. Instead, he gets tza'akah, an outcry. And the implication behind this term outcry is specifically that this is the outcry of the oppressed. Those who are being oppressed by a system that pushes the poor to the side, that does not take care of the widows and the orphans, that beleaguers anyone who wants to fit into society and seek the God of Israel, and those people get pushed to the side by the haves versus the have-nots. Right? That's a great rendering, a cry of distress. Yeah, that's a great translation because that's a good sense for sense of the very idea. Now, I mentioned some moments ago that Jesus himself does not institute, technically speaking, the use of parables. Parables were already in use among the Jewish people long before Jesus' advent, and even among some other peoples of the ancient Near Eastern world. But it's interesting to consider that not only does Jesus pick up the ball that had already been very familiar to the Israelites before his coming and use his parables to teach and to challenge his audience with messages that they might not otherwise like to hear, but Jesus also bases some of his parables on earlier works. So he expands upon some of the earlier parables of prophets like Isaiah. Let's take a look at one such example from Mark 12, if you want to follow me there. Mark 12, beginning in verse 1. Then he, and that is Jesus, began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, placed a fence around it, dug a wine vat, built a tower, rented it out to farmers, and went abroad. You see those points of comparison with Isaiah's narrative? Okay? With a few things added, to be sure. Then he sent a servant to the farmers that season, that he might receive from the farmers some of the fruit of the vineyard. When they had a hold of the servant, they beat him and sent him away empty-handed. So he sent another servant to them, and that servant they beat on the head and dishonored. Then he sent another servant, and that servant they killed, along with many others, beating some and killing others. The man had yet one beloved son. He sent him last to the farmers, saying, "They will respect my son." But those farmers said among themselves, "This one is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." I don't exactly follow that logic, but nonetheless, this is their plot. So they laid hold of him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the master of the vineyard do? Once again, who knows within the original context of Jesus delivering this parable whether there might have been an expectation in the crowd to shout out loud the answer, or whether it was just received as a rhetorical question. But the answer is clear enough, right? We can already anticipate at least what he's feeling after this. And Jesus, he spells it out. He will come and destroy those farmers and give the vineyard to others. I'm skipping over just a few verses here, not to get distracted with some other important things, but notice this line in verse 12. Then they began seeking to seize him, or you might have in your translations, arrest him, same. But they feared the crowd, for they knew that he spoke the parable in reference to them. So they left him and went away. All right, my question to you, who was the they here in this parable? Who wants to seize him, but they're afraid because of the crowd? Can't be the whole crowd, right? That's right. If you take a look, in fact, in the previous chapter, you always want to take a look at the surrounding context whenever you can to see if that gives you some clues that aren't already evident within the text. And it mentions, around verse 27, I believe, that Jesus is approached by the high priests, by the scribes, by the elders, so leaders of the Jews, particularly in the city of Jerusalem. It's the leadership that feel personally offended by this parable. The crowds, however, are the ones that they fear. That seems to speak to the fact that this message might have been rather popular with the crowds, or at least Jesus himself was popular enough. So they didn't want to lay a finger on him at that moment. And what does that say about the parable itself? In Jesus' reworking of the parable of Isaiah, and again, did you see all those common elements? Right? The care that this vineyard owner takes for the vineyard. A lot of those same wording is found in the gospel narrative as well. And yet, obviously, Jesus is expanding the idea to turn it into a somewhat different story. Now, you may have noticed, the guilty party is no longer the vine. It's no longer that plant. Who's the guilty party? In the metaphor. Oh, yeah, that would be what's symbolized. And in terms of the parable itself, the surface level, it's those farmers, right? The tenant farmers to whom this owner rents out his property. Now, in the terms of economics of those days, tenant farming was all over the place, even in the history of our own nation. That's not unfamiliar. And if you are a tenant farmer, you're taking advantage of somebody else renting to you a piece of his property. And what's understood is when the time comes for that person to collect from you the payment for your right to use that land, then you simply pay. That's what's understood. But these are wicked tenant farmers. They're not obeying the economic standards of the day. They're trying to cheat this owner. And clearly this is, like I said, it's drawing attention away from the vine itself. And sure enough, in Isaiah's message, from the commoners all the way up to the leadership, it seems as though there were hardly any who were not guilty in some way based on Isaiah's rhetoric. But Jesus takes a particular interest in addressing the leaders because, as we read from other parts of the Bible, aren't those in leadership most responsible? They will receive greater condemnation, right? If they do not shepherd or lead or govern well. And so Jesus turns this into a conversation with the leadership, even though Jesus will have plenty of warnings to the common people of Jerusalem and the regions of Galilee as well. Well, let's jump back to Isaiah now. Let's see the rest of what Isaiah says and see how even this can be in conversation with the language of Jesus during his ministry. Isaiah moves from this parable, which leads the people of Judah, at least it should lead them to realize how wrong they've been, into a series of woe statements. Woe is just a word of mourning, lament, and so it shows how grieved the prophet is, or for that matter, Yahweh himself is, over the state of his people, Judah. And this is commonly found in the prophets especially, these woes, right? Woe to you. It's expressing sadness. I am just sad over you because this is the way you have been acting, and this is what awaits you. And Jesus himself, as one of his many hats, carries the hat of prophet. And so it's no wonder that Jesus uses some of this prophetic language as well in his woe statements. Woe to those, in Isaiah chapter 5, woe to those who join house to house, who connect field to field until there is no room, and you are left alone by yourselves in the midst of the land. Yahweh of armies has sworn in my hearing, the many houses shall become a desolation, the large and beautiful homes a place without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall produce 1 bath, and a homer's worth of seed shall produce an ephah. That last line is a statement of God's judgment for what's already gone wrong. And we don't even need to go into the particulars of how much is a bath versus 10 acres or homer versus an ephah. I think you get the idea, right? Spout it out to me. Let me know. What's the issue with this judgment? Yes?
House to house reference, is that joining themselves with pagans? Is that what joining house to house?
No, not a bad question. But presumably this could be one's own houses, just expanding and expanding on what you, or for that matter, your more immediate family or clan has a hold on.
Basically, all their efforts to multiply their homes and their produce and things like that for nothing. Is that what it's basically?
That's it. Yeah, you hit it on the head. All of their efforts to make themselves financially secure by buying up all this land, joining house to house, that's what that means, just getting more property for yourself. And keep in mind, within the law, there are stipulations in books like Deuteronomy about that very thing. Yahweh says to the people of Israel, the land is mine, you are merely tenants on it. That's very much like Jesus' language of the tenant farmers. Realize that. That's what Yahweh wants to hammer home with his people. He said, you have a status of tenants or even immigrants in my land. That is to say, it belongs to me, and I have allowed you, as your God, to live here. So remember that every time that you buy up property and trade. Remember that you're dealing in what ultimately belongs to me. And if you nudge the poor man out of his stake, at least some kind of small holding in this land, which is made holy by the fact that Yahweh's presence is there, if you try to push these people out, I will hear that outcry. I will take note of it. This is language coming to us from Deuteronomy. Read it for yourself if you're not already familiar. You'll see that as a very dominant theme. God cares for these poor voices and wants to make sure in the law that with such things as the Jubilee year, that people can return to old family holdings of property. And that's a means of trying to keep any one Israelite from nudging another out of any kind of holding in the land of God and his people. For all their efforts to make themselves feel secure, not by trusting in God, but by trusting in their own economic ventures, the message is, let's say that you now have 10 sprawling acres of vineyard. Just imagine all that you might expect coming out of that, a bath, all right? Very small measure compared to the many baths that you would be expecting, hundreds of baths at least, coming as yield from a vineyard like that. Or a homer's worth of seed. Again, a lot of seed producing a mere ephah in weight once it's ground, or once it's flowered, once it's come to fruit. All right, so you see the warning here, right? And it's strongly a warning against the haves rather than the have-nots. We've talked about this before in this series already, that many of these prophets, and this rings true with Jesus as well, once again, in his particular role as prophet, among the other roles he fulfills, we see the prophets not often spending that much time on the cultic system. And by cultic system, I mean that's another term for coming to worship, how you worship communally. They're not often addressing that, going through the proper steps when you're in the temple, or what kind of sacrifices you're bringing, like you didn't bring the right sacrifice. You do not often hear that from them, do you? What you do hear predominantly from the prophets is either addressing idolatry, that is to say, breaking their covenant bond with their God Yahweh and going and trusting in other sources for strength, rather than the one true God that could help them, really. The other major issue that you see time and again throughout the prophets is this matter of social responsibility. Am I caring for the poor? Am I considerate for my fellow Israelites, at least, out there in the world? If I don't have that right, I can get so much of the proper order of worship and such correct and still not be pleasing to God. And that's a shocking message. It was to them. It was supposed to be. And if we hear it rightly, it can be rather arresting today. Once again, read those Gospels. Read Jesus' words as if you had never heard them before. They sound powerful, don't they? When someone strikes you on the cheek, turn to him the other. That's hard. That is really hard to do. All right? If someone takes your cloak from you, give them your shirt also. That's hard. What does my human side tell me to do? Yeah, that's right. Eye for an eye, and that's legal. That's in the law. Yeah. It teaches me to do the same thing that I did back when I was in kindergarten, right? Give that back. Only maybe with a little more sophistication in our wording, and yet the sophistication of the matter itself has not really matured. All right? But Christ calls us to be a sacrificial people, meaning we're sacrificing ourselves. That's a hard task. Thankfully, thanks to God, we are empowered by his Spirit that can work beyond what our human natures are inclined to do. We do have to trust in his Spirit and walk by the Spirit. But left to ourselves, nothing would change. We're humans. We have to realize that. Well, let's continue with Isaiah's woe messages in chapter 5, verse 11. Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they might chase after beer, who stay late at evening that wine may inflame them, don't think that any of us are off the hook just because you may or may not be addicted to alcohol, right? Any number of other things that draw our attention away from God's ways could be our own version of beer or wine. They regard the lyre, the harp, the tambourine, the flute, and the wine of their banquets. Now think about these things. Lyres, harps, flutes, these are not bad things, right? They make nice music, and they make celebratory music in this kind of a context. But the idea is these people of Jerusalem are distracting themselves with entertainment when there are pressing matters at hand that God wants to draw their attention to, and that's when otherwise innocuous things become rather dangerous to the people of Judah. So here's what they've gotten wrong. But the work of Yahweh they do not regard, and the activity of his hands they do not notice. Therefore, my people have gone into exile for lack of knowledge. Their honorable are starving men, and their commoners are parched with thirst. Even though this is speaking in the past tense, they have gone into exile, it may, if anything, be anticipating some future that will happen, and it's as good as already having happened. Right? My people have gone to exile. Therefore, Sheol has widened her throat and broadened her mouth to no end, and their nobility, their commoners, and their rabble and throngs shall descend into it. The people shall be bowed, and the men shall be humbled, and the eyes of the prideful shall be humbled. Once again, that part of society that God, through his prophet, seemed to be addressing especially, even though this is rather all-encompassing, but those that tend to get a lot of focus are those that are the haves. Either they have power or they have the means of wealth, but they're not using it appropriately. But Yahweh shall be exalted in justice, and the holy God shall be hallowed in righteousness. Now, notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say merely, Yahweh shall be exalted in power. I mean, that would go without saying anyway. Right? Yahweh will be exalted through force. It doesn't say that. It says, Yahweh shall be exalted in justice. The holy God shall be hallowed in righteousness. The prideful shall fall. Those who have oppressed others, or at the very least maybe have been merely apathetic toward the needs of these suffering, they'll be brought low. God will be exalted, but not by the typical kind of overthrow mentality, but in his righteousness, in the justice that he craves, that his people appreciate and practice themselves. It's fabulous language if you consider it for what he's saying here. Now, take a moment to step back for a moment and see here this language of Sheol widening her throat. Do you have other translations there for Sheol? Say again? That's right. King James Version says hell. Okay? Hence those pictures I first showed you as we began tonight's lesson. Remember those? You can look at any number of illuminated manuscripts from medieval Europe and see those ghastly pictures of the mouth of hell portrayed like some kind of a beast. Other translations? Death. Yeah, that's a good rendering. Okay? Death, hell, Sheol. Even Hades would be a good rendering. But here's the thing. It's not hell. Right? That was a choice made in the times of the King James Version, the Authorized Version, when that was first being put together, and admittedly by a group of some of the greatest minds of the day. It's not as though these people were ignorant. They were very well informed, and yet more has come to light in the centuries since that version was made to tell us that this is not hell. This is not that place where we conceive of eternal fiery punishment, which itself is a very complex conversation for another time too. There are other nuances to the way that Jesus talks about hell. But the term is Sheol in Hebrew. The realm of the dead, the netherworld, you might call it. The Greeks called it Hades. It's this land that is a mystery to all people until we have one person, one very special person, come back from that realm, never to decay again. And we call him Lord. All right? And he has the keys to death and to Hades. That need not scare us as much as it did at one time. But back in Israel's past, for the great majority, I would tell you, of the Hebrew Bible, any kind of a concept of eternal torment, eternal punishment, that thing that gives us a sick fascination, that's not present in the great majority of the Hebrew Bible. You do see it in Daniel chapter 12. It talks about some going to everlasting torment. But for the majority of the Hebrew Bible, the greatest punishment that your average Israelite could conceive of is merely being cut off from the land of the living. Death. That's why, for example, in the language of Moses and Deuteronomy, as they close the covenant, he says, I have set before you today life and death. Choose life. That's a better choice. Right? So, for them, that is punishment, to be cut off from the face of God, to go to the realm of dead, that is so mysterious. That is their sense of punishment. And I'll mention within this context, not only does it point us away from turning this into that hell monster with a large gaping mouth, and many of us might picture those classic images of demons with pitchforks, punishing those souls of the damned for eternity, which that's not a picture given to us in the Bible of little demons with pitchforks. But what we can come away with is perhaps you might say a tamer conversation. Here is Yahweh talking to these people who have used force to elevate themselves, and his plea with them, because he tries to reason with them through the parable, is, do you not realize the justice that's being misplaced here? The righteousness of God that you should be valuing, but instead you're valuing these forms of entertainment, these distractions. And yet he's trying to call them back, to reason with them, rather than merely to say, guess what? You're going to be tormented in these crazy, terrible ways. That's not the conversation. Conversation is that you will be removed from life, because where is life found? In God, right? But note this last little element of this passage in particular. The lambs will graze in their pasture, and the remaining fatlings shall eat at the ruins. This itself is yet another metaphor woven in there. Who do you think those lambs might potentially be, or these remaining fatlings? I don't think he's just talking about lambs. I think that's what we're talking about. I think we have in mind here something very much like when we read in the Gospels that Jesus saw the multitudes, and to him they seemed like sheep without a shepherd. He cared for them. Their leaders of late had not been taking good care, but he was moved with pity. Here is God in this conversation indicating he is moved with pity for these people that have not been taken care of. They've been taken advantage of. But he will make a way, and he will rise again, not through the language of might, but through justice being reestablished, through righteousness finally settling in the land, and then things will be set right. This is only part of a much larger conversation. And let me leave you with this one thought. Even the language of Lucifer, we have a lot of Christian tradition thinking about Lucifer falling from heaven down to hell, coming to us from Isaiah 14, the same book, Isaiah. But Lucifer is not Satan. Lucifer, if you read chapters 13 and 14 of Isaiah, you will find to be somebody else. You'll find it to be the king of Babylon, another one of those haves who had oppressed the have-nots. And it's a message of God's eventual judgment on him that, guess what? Even though today you seem like you're a god among men, one day you'll meet the same fate that befalls all mankind. You will enter the realm of Sheol. Read that with that new light in mind, and think about the complexity of some of these oracles of judgment within books like Isaiah. Thank you all.